The morning it turned, there was frost on the greenhouse glass, and my hands were black to the wrist. Not dirty black, not grease black like an engine gives you. This was the deep black of composted manure, worked so fine it feels like flour, and I remember standing there at 5:30 in the morning with that black packed under every fingernail I had, watching a man twice my age and 3 times my size count out bills onto a potting bench like he was afraid to hand them to me directly. He didn't look at me while he did it. He looked at the tomato seedlings. There were 2 long tables of them under that glass, and even a stranger walking in cold would have seen it in about 4 seconds. One side of that greenhouse was thriving, and the other side was dying, and the only difference between them was what I'd put in the soil 6 weeks before, on a Saturday in early April, with a bucket and a trowel, and nobody helping me because nobody believed it would work. He'd called me the manure kid to my face once, back in November, in front of the feed store with 3 other men laughing along. Said it like it was the whole of what I was. A boy who hauls muck by hand because he can't afford a spreader, can't afford a tractor, can't afford much of anything a 14-year-old shouldn't have to think about in the first place. Now there was a check on that bench with his name signed at the bottom, and an order sheet beside it wanting 40 pounds a week starting that Monday, and he still hadn't said a word to me except how much and when. I want you to understand something before I go any further, because I think it matters more than the money did. I wasn't proud in that moment. I want to say I was, that I stood there feeling like I'd won something, but mostly, I just felt tired, and a little bit disbelieving, the way you feel when a thing you've worked toward in the dark turns out to be real once the light hits it. That check was for $11. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was that he'd come to me. But to tell you how a 14-year-old boy with black hands ended up standing in that greenhouse being handed money by the man who'd laughed loudest at the feed store, I have to go back about a year and a half. To a Tuesday in November of 1961, to a letter from a county lawyer I wasn't expecting, and to a farm that everybody, the banker, the neighbors, even for a while I myself, believed a boy that age had no business trying to keep. The Tuesday, I mean, was November 14th, 1961, and it started the way most of that autumn had started, with a frost so thick on the kitchen window I had to breathe on the glass to see the barn. My grandfather didn't come down for coffee. I remember that more than I remember finding him, which is a strange thing to say, but the mind holds on to the ordinary moments right up until it can't anymore. He was sitting in the chair by the stove, the one with the cracked leather arm he'd been meaning to fix since summer, and he looked like a man who'd just closed his eyes to rest them. Dr. Halverson came out from town, 12 miles on roads still slick with the morning's ice, and said it was his heart, that it had likely been going bad for a long while, and he'd never once mentioned it to anybody, which didn't surprise me, because he was a man who kept his troubles the way he kept his tools, put away, accounted for, never left lying where someone might trip over them. The funeral was that Saturday at the Lutheran Church on County Road 9, and maybe 30 people came, most of them there for my grandmother's memory more than his, since she'd been gone 6 years by then, and he'd gotten quieter every year after. I stood at the front in a borrowed black coat, 2 sizes too big, and did not cry. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I kept thinking about the cows needing milked that evening, regardless of who was in the ground. The letter came the following Thursday, on paper with a letterhead I didn't recognize. Wendell Cruz, attorney at law of the county seat, informing me, in the flat language lawyers use for the largest things in a person's life, that I was the sole named inheritor of the farm. 40 acres, the house, the outbuildings, 1 dairy cow, 1 draft horse, and a debt of $340 owed jointly to Halberg Feed and Seed and the Farmers State Bank, due in full or renegotiated by the 1st of April, 1962, or the note would be called and the land sold to satisfy it. I read that letter standing in the kitchen with my coat still on, and I remember the specific quiet of the house around me, how it had never been quiet like that before, not even in winter, and I remember thinking that I was 14 years old and I did not know the first thing about what a note being called actually meant, only that the sound of it frightened me more than the funeral had. The cow was named Bessie, a Guernsey with a swayed back and a patient eye, and she did not care that I was 14, or that my father was 3 years in his own grave from a tractor rollover, or that my mother had gone to live with her sister in Grand Island the winter after that, and never really came back to us in any way that mattered. Bessie needed milking at 5:30 in the morning and 5:30 at night, and she taught me the first real lesson of that year, which was that animals do not grant extensions. The horse was named Duke, a big sorrel gelding going gray around the muzzle, too old for the plow work he'd once done, but still able to pull a stone boat, or a light wagon, if I was patient with him, and patience was the one thing I had more of than money. I fell into a schedule without deciding to. Up before light, milk Bessie, feed the chickens what we had left of them, 11 hens and a rooster too mean to eat, slop the 2 hogs, muck the barn, walk to school when the roads allowed it, and stay home when they didn't, then home again to the same chores in reverse. The manure I hauled by hand, wheelbarrow load by wheelbarrow load, because the spreader had a broken axle I didn't have $4 to fix, and I hauled it to a low corner of the garden plot my grandfather had always favored, not knowing yet why. It was Orville Petch, 3 farms over, who saw me at it one Saturday in early December, and laughed loud enough that his own boy looked embarrassed for him. "There goes the manure kid," he said to no one in particular, the way a man says something he intends to be repeated. And it was repeated, at the feed store and at church, and once, worst of all, by the banker himself, a heavy, soft-handed man named Delbert Anson, who said it to my face, with a smile that wanted me to smile back, as though we were sharing something, instead of him taking something from me. I did not smile back. I did not say anything at all, which I have found since is its own kind of answer, though at 14, it felt only like swallowing something with edges. I went home that evening and did the chores in the dark with a lantern hung on a nail, and I remember the particular shame of it, hot in my chest, and beneath the shame, something harder starting to set, like frost forming in a pattern you can't see until you hold the glass to the light. The sense that if hauling manure by hand was the whole of what they thought I was capable of, then I would hitch myself to the wheelbarrow and prove that a boy could out-stubborn a whole county's opinion, and it was some weeks after that, going through the barn loft for a coil of rope I remembered my grandfather keeping, that I found the chest with the burned initials that were not his. The loft held its own weather, separate from the barn below, dust hanging gold where the light came through the gaps in the board siding, and under it, the smell of old hay gone soft and sweet with rot, and something else beneath that, oil and iron, and the particular must of wood that has not been opened in a long time. I was on my knees looking for the rope, pushing aside a broken sled runner and a coil of wire nobody had used since before I was born, when my hand found the corner of it under a horse blanket stiff with dust. I pulled the blanket back, the way you'd pull a sheet off a bed you didn't know was made up, and there it was. It was a chest, maybe 2 feet by 3, made of some dark wood I didn't recognize at the time. Walnut, I'd learn later, and good walnut at that, the kind nobody would waste on a box unless the box mattered. The lid had initials burned into it, deep, done with care, not scratched in a hurry. They were not my grandfather's initials. I knew his handwriting well enough by then, from the feed receipts and the calendar in the kitchen, and this was older than that, older than a hand that learned its letters in this century. A brass padlock hung through a hasp gone dark with age, and when I took hold of it and pulled, it held the way something holds when it has held for a long time and intends to keep holding. I sat back on my heels and looked at it a while. There is a kind of curiosity that wants to force a thing open right then, and there is another kind that tells you a locked box has been locked on purpose by someone who is not you, and that whatever is inside will still be inside tomorrow, and the next week, and however long it takes to find the key honestly, instead of breaking the lock like Delbert Anson might have, quick and careless, the way he'd broken the news of what he thought of me. I did not force it. I set it back under the blanket, not to hide it exactly, but the way you'd cover a thing you meant to come back to with clean hands. I found the rope I'd come up for, coiled under a nail keg, and climbed back down the loft ladder with it over my shoulder, and I did not tell anyone what I'd found. Not the neighbor boy who sometimes came by to help with the milking, not the banker who would not have cared, not even, at first, myself, in the sense of letting it sit in my mind as anything more than a curiosity. But that night, doing the evening chores by lantern light same as always, I found myself thinking of those initials burned into the lid, and wondering whose hand had held the iron that made them, and what a man from that far back had thought worth locking away on a 40-acre farm that had never, as far as I knew, had much worth locking at all. The notebook I found 3 days later, and not in the chest at all, but in the house, which shows you how a person can walk past a thing 100 times and only see it on the 101st. It was in the drawer under the kitchen window, the one that stuck in wet weather, where my grandfather had kept string and nails and a broken pocket knife he never threw out. I was looking for a pencil to mark the calendar for the vet's visit to the cow, and my hand came down on leather instead of tin, and I pulled out a book gone soft and dark at the corners, the way leather gets when it has been carried in a coat pocket through 30 winters. The first pages meant nothing to me. Columns of numbers, dates going back further than I had years to my name, 1931, 1934, 1938, and beside them fractions. I took it first for arithmetic problems he'd never finished. 3 parts straw to 1 part manure, turned on the 9th day, turned again on the 22nd, yield on the east quarter, bushels of tomatoes, bushels of squash, written down like a man keeping score in a game only he was playing. I sat at that table until the lamp burned low, turning pages slow, the way you'd turn the pages of a Bible you'd been told all your life was just a book of stories, and were only now finding out different. There were years where the yields dropped, and beside them a note in his cramped hand, too wet, turned late, my fault, like he was confessing to somebody. There were years the numbers climbed steady as a man walking uphill with a full load and not stopping to complain about it. 30 years of a man asking the same question over and over in 100 small variations, and answering it a little better each time, and never once, that I could find, telling a soul. I thought of Delbert Anson, and men like him who'd said my grandfather was wasting his time out there stirring dirt when he ought to have been running cattle like a sensible man, and I thought that they had been standing 3 feet from the answer to a question the whole county was still asking, without knowing they were asking it, which was how a man kept ground alive when everything told him it ought to be dead. I did not understand yet what I was holding. I want to be honest about that. I understood only that a dead man had left behind 30 years of patient, careful proof that he'd known something, and that the proof had been sitting in a drawer that stuck in wet weather, 6 feet from where he'd eaten his supper every night of his life, and nobody, not the banker, not the neighbors, not even, until that evening, me, had thought to ask what he'd been doing out there in the manure pile all those years he could have spent resting. I sat with the notebook a long while before I noticed the letters. They were not part of the notebook proper, just folded in behind the back cover. 3 of them, the paper gone soft and brown at the creases, like cloth that had been washed too many times. The ink had faded to the color of weak coffee. I almost took them for old receipts, and near enough set them aside before I saw the handwriting was not my grandfather's square, careful print, but something older, slanted and looping, a woman's hand, and at the bottom of the first one, a name I knew only from the family Bible on the front room shelf, my great-grandmother, who had come out to this ground in 1891 with a wagon and a husband, and as far as I had ever been told, not much else. The letters were dated 1936, the worst of the dry years, written to a sister back in Ohio who I gathered had asked why they didn't just give it up, like half the county was doing. She wrote that the wind had taken the Hendersons' topsoil clean off in a brown cloud you could see from 3 miles, and that she did not intend to lose hers the same way, and that she had been feeding the West 40 with everything the barn produced. Every scrap of manure, every bit of rotted straw, turned in and covered and left to work, for going on 8 years by then, and that the ground under her feet still held together in her hand like ground was supposed to, dark and crumbling instead of blowing away like flour off a plate. She wrote it plain, no complaint in it, the way a woman writes when she has already decided a thing and is only reporting on it. I read that letter twice, and then I understood what I was looking at, which was not one man's 30 years but nearer 60, because my grandfather had not invented anything out there in the manure pile. He had only kept doing what his mother had already proven kept land alive when the sky itself seemed set on killing it. The notebook wasn't the start of the thing, it was the middle of it. Somewhere under the floor of that farmhouse, or in the ground itself, there was a beginning I would never see. A woman standing in a wind that peeled paint off barns, deciding that rot and patience were stronger than dust. I folded the letters back exactly as I'd found them and set them behind the notebook's cover where they belonged, and I sat there in the lamplight a good while longer, not reading anything, just turning the fact of it over, that the thing Delbert Anson laughed at wasn't some strange notion of a lonely old man, but a family's whole quiet answer to the worst weather this county had ever seen, and I was the only living person who knew it. The letter from the bank came on a Thursday, the second week of December, brought out by the postman in his green county truck with the chains still on the tires from the last snow. It was typed on paper with the bank's letterhead across the top, First Farmers of the county seat, and it said what I already half knew sitting in my chest like a stone all that autumn, that the note my grandfather had taken out against the feed and seed the spring before he died, $340 of it, was due in full by the 1st of April, or the bank would call the note and the farm would go to auction on the courthouse steps, same as any other property behind on its debts. I read it standing at the kitchen table with my coat still on, and I read it again sitting down, and neither reading made the number smaller. $340 was not a fortune to some men. It was, that winter, everything I did not have. Word of the letter traveled the way things travel in a county that small, faster than I would have liked, and it wasn't 3 days before Orville Petch pulled his truck into my drive on a Sunday afternoon, engine still running, and leaned out the window without getting down, like a man who didn't intend to stay long enough to need a chair. He had 80 acres bordering mine to the west, and had wanted the creek frontage on my south 40 since before I was born, or so my grandfather used to say with a look that wasn't quite a smile. He said he'd heard about my trouble, said it plain and sorry-sounding, the way a man says a thing he's rehearsed. Said he'd take the whole place off my hands, house, barn, stock, and all, for $600, and I wouldn't have to worry about banks or auctions or any of it, and he'd even let me keep the milk cow if I wanted her, like that was the generous part. I stood in the yard with mud up past my ankles and told him no. He looked at me a long moment, the kind of look grown men give a boy when they expect him to reconsider before the sentence finishes leaving his mouth, and when I didn't, he said, "Suit yourself," and something about how the bank wasn't in the business of waiting on children to grow into their obligations, and then he backed out of the drive without another word, gravel popping under his tires. I went back inside and sat at the table where the letter still lay, and I thought about the $600, which was near double what I owed, and how easy it would have been to take it and be done with the whole cold, aching business of it. But I thought too of the letters behind the notebook's cover, and the woman standing in a wind that peeled paint off barns, and I understood that selling wasn't really mine to do, not with what I now knew was buried out there past the barn, waiting on me to be smart enough to use it before April came. The chest had sat under the workbench since before I could remember, and I'd been told as a boy not to touch it, the way you're told not to touch a stove that's already cold, the warning outlasting the reason for it. It was oak, dark with age and linseed oil, iron-strapped at the corners, and the lock on the front was a simple hasp lock, the kind you could buy at any hardware store for 30 cents, except this one had rusted into itself so thoroughly that no key would have turned it even if I'd had one. I tried a screwdriver first, then a chisel, and finally I took the flat bar off the wall and worked it under the hasp until the old screws gave up their grip on wood that had gone soft and gray around them. The lid came up with a sound like a held breath finally let go. Cold air came up out of it, and a smell of oil and dust and something drier underneath, like old paper left too long in a barn. On top lay a set of hand tools I didn't recognize by shape, a narrow forked spade, a long-handled turning fork with tines set at an angle I'd never seen on any tool at the feed store, a wooden paddle worn smooth on one edge. Each one was stamped near the grip with the same initials, burned in deep enough that 50 years hadn't faded them. E.A.H., my great-grandfather's initials, though I only knew that because I'd seen them once on a marriage record in the family Bible, and had to sit there a moment turning the paddle over in my hands before the name came back to me whole. Underneath the tools, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow, were sheets of paper covered edge to edge in pencil diagrams. A long trench shape, cross-sections showing layers, arrows marking which way a man ought to turn material, and on what day. Numbers in the margins I didn't yet understand, but recognized as the same hand, the same careful slant, as the notebook I'd already spent 100 nights reading by lamplight. Under the papers, wedged into the corner, sat a mason jar, its rubber seal long perished, a handful of dried seed rattling loose inside when I lifted it, a strip of paper tied around the neck with faded ink I could barely make out. I sat back on my heels in the cold of that barn with the wind working at the tin roof above me, and I understood, the way you understand a thing all at once instead of piece by piece, that nobody in this family had ever really been farming dirt. They'd been farming an idea about dirt, passed hand to hand, tool to tool, and somehow it had ended up here, in a locked box under a bench, waiting on someone to be foolish enough, or desperate enough, to open it before spring. I read those diagrams until I had them memorized the way other boys memorized batting averages. Then I went out and built the thing on the ground behind the barn, 40 feet of trench dug where the old cattle yard used to drain, and I started hauling. That winter of 1962 into spring was the coldest I can remember, though I expect every winter feels that way when you're doing the work alone. I had the horse, an old gray gelding named Pete, who'd carried my grandfather's plow for 11 years and seemed to regard the whole compost business with mild disapproval, and I had the one milk cow, Bessie, whose manure I collected morning and night like it was money, because in a sense it was. I hauled by hand cart when the ground was frozen too hard for the sled, forked the material into the windrows the way the diagrams showed, turned it on the schedule my grandfather had marked in the margins, day 9, day 17, day 26, even when my hands cracked and bled in the cold, and the thermometer nailed to the pump house read 4 degrees above zero. Orville Dice at the feed store took to calling out when I came in for oat straw, loud enough for the other men waiting on their orders to hear it. "Here comes the compost king," he'd say, and laugh at his own joke, and ask if I was planning to bottle it and sell it door to door. I paid for my straw and didn't answer, because I'd learned by then that answering only fed a man like that. Worse, in its way, was the afternoon in late February when I hauled a wagon load of cured black material into town, looking for a buyer, and stopped at the greenhouse on the edge of the county seat, run by a heavy-set man named Wendell Hark, who grew starts for half the gardens in 3 townships. He came out in his shirt sleeves, looked at my load, looked at me, and said he already had a supplier and didn't need a kid's science project cluttering his beds. He said it not unkindly, the way a man dismisses a fly, already turning back toward his greenhouse door before I'd finished loading the wagon again. I didn't argue with him either. I drove the load home in the dark, unloaded it back onto the pile, and went back to turning windrows the next morning before light, because the ground doesn't care what a greenhouse man thinks of you, and neither does compost working its slow chemistry through a cold March. I kept the notebook open on the workbench those weeks, checking my numbers against my grandfather's, watching the pile steam faintly in the freezing air on the mornings the reaction was running hot, and telling myself that whatever Hark believed about kids and science projects, the dirt itself hadn't voted yet. The first week of April that spring, 1963 by then, though I'd stopped marking the calendar as closely as I once had, the ground finally gave up enough of its frost that I could work the compost into the garden rows without the shovel bouncing off iron-hard clay. Danny came over most afternoons after his own chores, and between the two of us we turned 2 full acres under before the seed catalogs even arrived from Gurney's. I kept a sack of the finished material back, maybe 40 pounds, black and crumbling and smelling like a wet forest floor, and I didn't tell Danny why. On a Thursday, the 11th, I loaded that one sack into the wagon by itself and drove it into town again, past the feed store, past the bank where Mr. Halloran's window still had my note sitting somewhere in a drawer, and I left the sack on Wendell Hark's loading dock without knocking on his door. I didn't ask him for anything. I didn't leave a note explaining ratios or nitrogen or the 30 years of my grandfather's numbers behind it. I just left it there, the way you'd leave a jar of preserves on a porch rail for someone who'd never asked for one, and I drove home before he came out to see who'd been by. I told myself I wasn't hoping for anything. That was a lie I told well enough to believe it most days, but not on the drive home, when I found myself watching the road instead of thinking about the fencing that needed mending or the goat that had gotten into the beans twice that week. My grandfather used to say that a man plants a thing and then has to live through the part where he can't do anything more about it. That the waiting is its own kind of labor, quieter than the digging, but just as long. I understood that sentence better in April of 1963 than I had the first 10 times I'd read it in his notebook. 2 weeks passed. Nothing came from town. I planted my own beds, tomatoes first, then the squash, working the black compost in by hand, exactly as the diagrams in the old chest had shown, 6 inches deep, worked under, and not just laid on top, the way my great-grandmother's letters had described doing it in drought years when there was nothing else to feed the ground. Danny asked once if I'd heard anything from the greenhouse man. I said no. He didn't ask again, but I noticed he started walking past the mailbox slower than he used to, like he was checking it for me without saying so. By the first week of May, I'd nearly stopped thinking about the sack at all, until the truck came up the drive that didn't belong to anyone I knew, and a heavy-set man I recognized climbed down out of it, looking like he hadn't slept well in several nights. He didn't say hello first. He stood by the truck door with his hat still on, looking at the barn like he was deciding whether the trip had been worth the gas, and I noticed I had stopped hoeing before I'd made a conscious decision to stop. "You still got that manure?" he said. Not a question. I said I did. He said he wanted to see it, and I walked him back to the pile without saying anything else, because Grandpa's notebook had a line about men like this. You don't sell to a man who's arguing with himself, you let him argue and you wait. I let him look at the black crumbling heap, turn a handful over in his fingers the way I had 100 times, smell it, which surprised me, because most men wouldn't. He didn't buy anything that day. He left with a burlap sack of it in the truck bed and didn't say what he meant to do with it, and I didn't ask, because asking would have made it sound like I needed the answer. 3 weeks went by before Danny told me he'd heard from his cousin, who swept floors at the greenhouse, that half the seedling trays had gotten a treatment nobody else knew about, and the other half hadn't, and the greenhouse man wasn't saying why. I went into town on a Saturday near the end of May 1963 on an errand for feed, and I walked past the long glass building on Ferris Street without meaning to look in, and I looked in anyway. 2 rows of tomato starts, side by side under the same glass, the same water can, the same hands tending them. One row was pale and leggy, reaching for light it couldn't quite find. The other was dark green, thick-stemmed, already curling tendrils toward the stakes, 2 full weeks ahead of where the others stood. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't need to. He was standing at the end of the row with his arms crossed, and when he saw me through the glass he didn't wave, But he didn't look away either, and that told me more than a wave would have. It was the second Tuesday of June when his truck came up the drive again, same as before, except this time he had a ledger book under his arm instead of his hat pulled low, and he sat at my kitchen table, Grandpa's table, and asked what I'd take for it by the pound, and how much I could keep supplying through the fall, and whether I had enough manure coming to make it worth his while to stop buying whatever he'd been buying from the co-op in the next county over. I told him I'd need a day to look at my numbers. He said take the day. He didn't call me kid, he didn't call me anything at all, which was its own kind of answer, and I wrote his order down that night in the back of my grandfather's notebook, in the empty pages nobody had touched in 30 years. That order paid the last $40 on the note by the second week of August, 1963. I remember the date because it was the same week the bank sent a letter, not the lawyer this time, just the bank, typed plain, saying the account was closed and in good standing. I read it standing at the mailbox, and I didn't feel like shouting about it. I felt like sitting down in the grass a while, which is what I did. By the next spring, word had gone around the way it does in a county that size. One greenhouse man talking to another at the feed store, one market gardener seeing another's tomatoes come in 3 weeks early and asking why. Within 2 years I was hauling to 6 greenhouses and 4 market gardens from the county seat clear out past Willow Creek, and I'd taken on the hired hand boy full-time because I couldn't turn the piles fast enough alone. I bought a used spreader in the fall of 1963. The first piece of equipment I ever owned that wasn't older than my grandfather. I still did the turning by hand when the weather called for it, because the notebook said the heat built different that way, and the notebook had never once been wrong. I kept the chest in the barn where I found it, initials burned into the lid, tools inside oiled and used every season since. I kept the notebook in the kitchen, in the drawer under the bread box, and I still write in it, same as he did, same as whoever taught him did before there was a notebook at all. I never sold either one. Men have offered. A university man came through in 1966, wanting to buy the whole thing for a museum in Ames, and I told him it wasn't a museum piece, it was a tool, and tools get used or they get lost, and I wasn't in the business of losing things. So that's the whole of it. A boy, a debt, a pile of something everybody else was embarrassed to touch, and 30 years of somebody else's patience waiting in a drawer for me to open it. If anybody's ever called you too young, too green, too something to be trusted with what's in front of you, I'd say go look in the barn before you believe them. Look in the attic, look in the cellar, under the stairs, in whatever your grandfather left behind that nobody's opened in 40 years. It's usually not gold, it's usually just work, written down by somebody who did it longer than you've been alive. If you've got a story like that in your own family, I'd like to hear it. Put it down in the comments. And if this one was worth your time, stay around for the next.